3 horses waited, tethered to a post, sweating under the 3 o'clock sun, while a 4th man dismounted, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched to his chest as if it were a shield. "Another one," old Samuel muttered from the porch of the general store, not looking up from his pipe. "That's the 3rd this week." Inside the Hayward house, Margaret Ellis Hayward closed the door after seeing off her 3rd suitor in 6 days and leaned back against the wood with her eyes closed. Not from relief, but from a weariness that hadn't yet found a name. Half a mile away, with hands full of dirt and a hammer hanging from his belt, Thomas Ward Calloway was driving the last post of a fence that didn't need repairing, simply because working with his hands was the only way he knew to stop thinking about what he'd left unsaid for 3 years. The prairie stretched golden between the 2 houses, and the wind that crossed that space seemed to carry messages that neither of them dared to write. This is not just the story of a woman courted by 3 men in a single week. It is the story of a silence that cost more than either of them imagined, and of the question that one of them finally had the courage to ask. The town was called Millbrook Hollow, a settlement of fewer than 400 souls built around a watermill and a white wooden church in a territory that official maps barely bothered to name. It was 1879, and the previous winter had been so harsh that 3 families had packed their wagons and headed west, leaving empty houses that the wind used as instruments. Thomas was 29 years old and owned a farm he'd inherited from a father who died with his boots on, literally in the middle of the autumn planting. Since then, Thomas had learned to do everything: plow, shoe horses, repair roofs, and even, though he would never admit it out loud, sew when a button came off and there was no one else to do it. He had the hands of a man who worked the land and the eyes of someone who read more than the town considered necessary. He kept 3 books under his bed, bought in the big city on the only time he'd traveled beyond the county, and reread them in winter when work was scarce and thoughts were plentiful. He was not a man of many words. In Millbrook Hollow, the saying went, half in jest, half in admiration, that Thomas Calloway could go an entire day without speaking 10 words, and when he finally said something, it was worth listening to. What no one knew, because he had never said it, was that for 3 years he had been silently loving the same woman, and that silence had become a habit as ingrained as any other farm chore. Margaret was 26, an age the townswomen mentioned with a sort of pity disguised as concern, as if spinsterhood were a wound that needed to be pointed out loudly to heal. She had arrived in Millbrook Hollow 8 years ago, when her father, a traveling schoolmaster, finally decided to put down roots and open the county's only school. Margaret had grown up among grammar books and maps spread across the kitchen table, and when her father died of fever 2 winters ago, she had taken his place at the blackboard without being asked, simply because the children needed someone, and she knew how to teach. She was tall, with steady hands and a laugh that didn't come often, but, when it did, made the town's men linger their gaze a second longer. She had opinions she didn't keep to herself, and that, in a territory where women were expected to nod more than they spoke, had made her someone some admired, and others simply didn't know how to court. Thomas and Margaret had known each other since she arrived in town. He was 21 then, she was 18, and the first time they spoke was because Margaret's horse had lost a shoe halfway to school, and Thomas, who was passing by with his wagon, had gotten down without being asked and fixed the problem with the same naturalness with which he breathed. "You didn't have to do that," she had told him, holding the reins while he worked. "I know," he'd replied, not looking up, "but the shoe wasn't going to fix itself." She had laughed then, that infrequent laugh, and something in Thomas's chest settled into a new place he didn't know how to name until much later. From that day on, without either of them planning it, their paths began to cross with a regularity that the whole town noticed before they themselves did. Thomas would bring firewood to the school when the winter grew harsh, without being asked. Margaret would save the best seat in church by the window for when he arrived late after his farm chores. They were small gestures, so ordinary they could be mistaken for simple neighborliness, but they carried a weight within them that neither of them had put into words. What neither of them had said in 8 years was the obvious, that every time the other entered a room, the air changed temperature slightly. The autumn of that year brought a generous harvest, enough for several families in town to breathe a sigh of relief after 2 difficult years. And with the abundance came also something Millbrook Hollow hadn't seen in a long time. New men, travelers who stayed, merchants who decided to settle, all drawn by the promise of fertile land and a growing town. 3 of those men set their sights on Margaret Ellis Hayward almost at the same time. The first was Walter Brennan Ashford, a cloth merchant who had arrived in August with 2 wagons loaded with goods and a smile that knew exactly when to unfurl. He was polite, generous with compliments, and had gifted Margaret a fine wool shawl the second time they spoke, a gesture that was talked about in town for days. The second was Edmund Price Cole, owner of the only blacksmith shop besides Thomas's, a serious man, of few words but clear intentions, who had begun to appear at the school on Friday afternoons with the excuse of checking the door hinges, which never needed any repair. The third was Nathaniel Cross Whitfield, son of the county judge, who had the advantage of social position and the disadvantage of knowing it too well. That week in October, the 3 decided, without coordinating, that it was time to declare their intentions formally. And so it was that in 5 days, Margaret received 3 marriage proposals, each with flowers, each with rehearsed words, and each rejected with the same firm politeness. Thomas learned of the first proposal from the storekeeper while buying nails for a fence. He learned of the second from his own mother, who told him with a tone that pretended to be casual and wasn't. He learned of the third because he saw it with his own eyes. Nathaniel Whitfield dismounting in front of Margaret's house with a bouquet that must have cost more than any man in town's weekly wages. Every time he heard one of those pieces of news, something in Thomas's chest tightened like a string that had been pulled too taut for too long. But he said nothing. He didn't go to the school to interrupt. He didn't mount his horse to arrive before the others. He kept driving posts, shoeing horses, plowing land that was already plowed, because work was the only thing he knew how to do with his hands when his heart couldn't find words. What Thomas didn't know was that Margaret was rejecting each proposal thinking of him, comparing each bouquet of flowers, each rehearsed word, to a man who had never said anything close to, "I love you," but who for 8 years had brought firewood without being asked and saved the best seat by the window. Psychologists call this prolonged unexpressed love, a phenomenon that researcher Arthur Aaron, known for his studies on the formation of emotional closeness, documented as one of the most persistent states of human attachment. The mind, Aaron said, can sustain a deep bond for years without ever having verbal confirmation, simply feeding it with small, constant gestures. On Friday of that week, Margaret closed the door after the third rejection and sat on the porch with her hands in her lap, looking out at the golden prairie that separated her house from Thomas's. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think aloud, almost as a confession to herself. "Why doesn't he ask?" she murmured, and the wind, as always, did not answer. But something had changed that afternoon, though neither of them knew it yet. That night, Margaret made a silent decision. If Thomas didn't ask before autumn ended, she would stop waiting. And it was then, without either of them knowing, that everything began to move towards a point of no return. The following Sunday, at the white wooden church, Thomas arrived late as usual, his boots still stained with dirt from the stable. He scanned for the seat by the window, the one Margaret always saved for him, and found it empty, as it was every week. But this time, when he sat down, he noticed that she was looking at him in a different way. Not the kind, familiar gaze of usual, but something more akin to an unspoken question. After the service, as the congregation dispersed among greetings and conversations about the harvest, Margaret approached him with an envelope in her hand. "It's an invitation," she said, without beating around the bush. "The harvest fair is next Saturday. My father used to say that fairs are the only place where the whole town can see what truly matters." Thomas took the envelope with hands that suddenly didn't know what to do. "I'll be there," he said, and that was all he could articulate, though inside something screamed at him to say more, to ask what she meant by those words, to break the 8-year silence for once. But he didn't. And Margaret, who had expected something more, something different, nodded, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and walked away. That night, in the solitude of his farm, Thomas took one of his 3 books out from under the bed, but he couldn't read a single line. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind beat against the windows, thinking of the 3 bouquets of flowers Margaret had rejected that week, and the question he had been avoiding for 8 years. "What are you waiting for?" he asked himself aloud, to the empty room, and for the first time in a long time, he had no answer that brought him peace. Walter Ashford, the merchant, was not a man to give up easily. 3 days after his rejection, he returned to Millbrook Hollow, with the excuse of delivering a fabric order to the general store, but his true purpose was clear to anyone watching him loiter near the school at dismissal time. "Miss Hayward," he said, intercepting her on the path with a politeness that was beginning to feel forced. "I've been thinking, and I believe perhaps my proposal was too hasty. Allow me to court you properly, with the time you deserve." Margaret stopped, holding her books against her chest. "Mr. Ashford, I appreciate your persistence, but my answer will not change with more time. It's not a matter of haste." "Then it's another man," he said, and for the first time his tone lost its rehearsed softness. "The blacksmith, Calloway. I've seen how people in town look at you two." Margaret felt a heat rise to her face, not from shame, but from an indignation she hadn't expected. "That is none of your business, Mr. Ashford." "Perhaps not," he replied, picking up his hat from the ground where it had fallen. "But allow me to tell you something, Miss Hayward. A man who waits 8 years to say what he feels either doesn't feel it strongly enough or doesn't have the courage to say it. Either reason should concern you." The words lodged themselves in Margaret like a splinter, not because they were kind, they weren't, but because they touched a fear she herself had begun to cultivate in silence. That night, while correcting exams under the light of an oil lamp, Margaret found herself rereading the same sentence 5 times without comprehending it, because her mind was elsewhere. 8 years of firewood delivered without asking for anything in return, a seat by the window saved every Sunday, and the question Walter Ashford had left hanging in the air like an accusation. What if Thomas never asked? What if she spent the rest of her life saving a seat for a man who would never sit by her side by choice, but out of habit? The harvest fair arrived with a clear sky and an air that was already beginning to announce winter. All of Millbrook Hollow gathered in the open field by the mill. There were tables laden with freshly baked bread, target shooting competitions, violin music that some traveler had brought along, and the unspoken but understood promise that at this fair, several things that the town had been whispering about for weeks would be decided. Thomas arrived early, dressed in the only decent jacket he owned, and spent the first hour helping to set up tables, because he didn't know what else to do with his hands while he waited to see Margaret. When he finally saw her, she was wearing a blue dress he'd never seen her in before, and she was surrounded, as expected, by the 3 men who had courted her that week, each subtly competing for her attention with witty remarks and calculated attentiveness. Edmund Cole was offering her a plate of pie. Nathaniel Whitfield was telling her about a recent trip to the capital city. And Walter Ashford, with that smile that knew exactly when to unfurl, was whispering something that made her laugh. That infrequent laugh that Thomas knew better than his own name. Something broke inside Thomas at that moment. Not exactly from jealousy, but from a sudden, painful clarity. He was about to lose her. Not because she preferred him less, but because he had never given her a clear reason to choose him over any of those 3 men who did know how to say the right words. He stayed on the sidelines of the celebration for almost an hour, observing from a distance, until his mother, a small woman with hands weathered by work, came up and sat beside him in silence. "Are you going to stand there all afternoon?" she asked finally, without preamble. "I don't know what to say, Mama." "Your father didn't know what to say either," she replied, looking towards the field where Margaret was laughing again. "But he said something, once, and that's why I'm here, and that's why you're here. Perfect words don't exist, Thomas. Only words said in time, and those that aren't." That sentence echoed in Thomas like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Mid-afternoon, there was a target shooting competition, a fair tradition where the town's men competed for fun and pride, and Thomas, almost without thinking, signed up. Not for the flowers or Margaret's attention, but because he needed to do something with his hands, while he decided what to do with his words. He won, as everyone expected him to win. He was, after all, the best shot in the county. But as he approached to receive the small trophy, a hand-sewn blue ribbon, his eyes searched for Margaret's among the crowd. She was already looking at him, and for a moment, just a moment, neither of them looked away. It was Edmund Cole who broke the spell, offering Margaret another glass of lemonade with a smile that pretended to be unconcerned. Thomas lowered his gaze to the blue ribbon in his hand and felt, for the first time in 8 years, that the silence he had so long protected was beginning to cost him more than he could afford to pay. That night, after the fair ended and families returned to their homes under a sky heavy with stars, Thomas did not go directly to his farm. Instead, he walked to the large tree that grew halfway between his property and Margaret's, a century-old oak where all the town's boys used to gather as children, and sat beneath its branches with the blue ribbon still in his hand. He didn't know how long he sat there, thinking, until he heard footsteps on the dry grass and looked up to find Margaret, still in her blue dress, walking toward him with her arms crossed against the night's chill. "I couldn't sleep," she said, as an explanation, sitting at a prudent distance on the fallen trunk beside the tree. "Me neither," Thomas replied. They remained silent for a moment, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who know each other well enough not to need to fill it with unnecessary words. "Walter told me something the other day," Margaret finally said, looking at the stars instead of at him. "He said that a man who waits 8 years either doesn't feel strongly enough or doesn't have the courage to say it." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "And what do you think?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. Margaret turned to him then, and for the first time in 8 years, her gaze held no longer the gentle patience of usual, but something more urgent, more weary. "I think I don't know what to think anymore, Thomas. I think I've been saving you a place by the window for 8 years, and you've been bringing me firewood for 8 years, and neither of us has ever said what that means. And this week, 3 men asked me what you never asked, and I had to say no to all 3, because none of them was you. But you haven't even tried." The words came out of her with a frankness that surprised even herself, and for a moment she seemed regretful of having said them. But she didn't take them back. Thomas looked at her, the blue ribbon forgotten in his hand, as something broke inside him, something he had been holding back for 8 years, under layers of work and silence and fear of not being enough. "I'm afraid," he finally said, and the confession cost him more than any physical labor he had ever done. "I'm afraid that if I say it, and you don't feel the same, I'll lose even this friendship, these Sundays, this firewood I bring without you asking, because it's the only way I have of telling you something without saying it." Margaret felt her eyes well up with tears, not of sadness, but of devastating relief, as if someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been closed for years. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling, "I've been waiting 8 years for you to ask." Before continuing, let me ask you something, you who are watching this now. From what country are you visiting us today? Write it in the comments. I'd love to know from where, at this very moment, you are listening to this story. The wind stirred the branches of the oak, and Thomas, his hands still stained with the day's dirt, the blue ribbon falling forgotten onto the grass, stepped closer to Margaret and took her hands in his, rough against hers, which smelled faintly of chalk and paper. "Margaret Ellis Hayward," he said, and his voice no longer trembled, as if saying her full name had given him the courage he needed. "I've been loving you without saying it for 8 years. And this week I saw 3 men ask for what I never had the courage to ask for. And I understood that the silence I thought protected me was only costing me the only thing I truly want in this life." He paused, breathing deeply, as if the next words weighed more than any burden he had ever carried on his farm. "Will you marry me, Margaret? I don't have a ring yet, nor a rehearsed speech, nor fine fabrics to offer you. I only have 8 years of delivered firewood and a heart that has been yours since the first time I laughed, that you laughed by the roadside, with that laugh that doesn't come often, but is worth more than anything those 3 men can offer you." The silence that followed lasted no more than 5 seconds, but to Thomas it seemed an eternity. The kind of silence that contained 8 years of waiting compressed into an instant. And then Margaret smiled, that infrequent laugh finally escaping in a sound that was half laughter and half cry, and nodded before she could articulate the words. "Yes," she finally said. "Yes, Thomas. I've been waiting 8 years for this question, and the answer was always yes." What followed was not a fairy tale kiss, but something clumsier and more real. Thomas, still holding her hands, leaning towards her with the uncertainty of a man who had never done this before, and Margaret meeting him halfway, and the century-old oak being a silent witness to 8 years of silence, finally broken. The news spread through Millbrook Hollow faster than any wagon could have traveled. By the following Monday, the whole town knew that Thomas Calloway and Margaret Hayward would marry before winter's end, and the general reaction was a mixture of surprise and a strange relief, as if the entire town had been holding its breath for 8 years without knowing it. Walter Ashford, upon hearing the news, simply nodded with an expression that was not exactly defeat, but something more akin to understanding. Edmund Cole sent Thomas, without being asked, a set of new tools as an engagement gift, a silent gesture between two blacksmiths who understood the language of work better than that of words. Nathaniel Whitfield, with his characteristic distant elegance, simply stopped appearing at the school on Fridays. The wedding was held in December, under a gray sky that threatened snow, in the same white wooden church where Thomas had arrived late for 8 years to sit by the window. This time, he was not late. He arrived 2 hours early, dressed in a borrowed suit that was slightly short in the sleeves, and waited at the front with hands trembling in a way no physical labor had ever caused. Margaret walked towards him in a dress sewn by the townswomen in just 3 weeks, each contributing a stitch, a collective gesture from a community that had watched 8 years of silence and was finally celebrating its end. Building a life together was not, as in fairy tales, a continuous series of perfect moments. It was, instead, something more akin to what they had already been building for 8 years, only now with a name and a promise. Thomas still brought firewood, but now he brought it to his own home, where Margaret awaited him. Margaret continued to teach at the school, and Thomas, on days when farm work allowed, would sit at the back of the classroom to wait for her, to walk back together. They learned, as all real couples do, to argue without the silence settling between them again as a dangerous habit. The first time they had a real fight, over something as small as where to build a new barn, Thomas felt the old impulse to shut down, to retreat into silent work until the feeling passed. But he stopped halfway to the door. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't do that anymore." And he stayed, and they talked, awkwardly, until they found an agreement that satisfied them both. Psychologist John Gottman, after decades studying thousands of couples in what he called the Love Lab, discovered that it is not the absence of conflict that predicts a lasting marriage, but the willingness of both members to remain present during disagreement, rather than retreating into silence, which, in terms of his research, proves to be one of the strongest predictors of relationship failure. Thomas, without ever having read Gottman, seemed to understand this truth in his bones. The silence that had once protected his heart now threatened to destroy what he had worked so hard to build, and every day he chose, consciously, not to return to it. 23 years passed between that December and an autumn afternoon not unlike the week that changed everything. The farm had grown. What was once a man's lone struggle against the land was now a home full of life. 3 children, now adults, who had inherited their father's skilled hands and their mother's firm tongue. A house expanded with each year of marriage, each room added, marking a different stage of their life together. Margaret, her hair now silver at the temples, still taught at the town school, though now with the help of her eldest daughter, who had inherited her passion for books. Thomas, his hands more weathered than ever, still shod horses on Saturdays, though his youngest son had begun to take the reins of the business. That autumn afternoon, 23 years after the proposal under the oak tree, Thomas returned from the blacksmith shop, as he did every day, and found Margaret sitting on the same porch where she had waited for so many answers, now sewing something for one of her grandchildren. He sat beside her in silence, as he had learned to do without silence meaning distance, but simply the comfort of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. "Do you remember the oak?" Margaret asked, not looking up from her sewing. "I remember it every day," Thomas replied. And it was true. The tree was still standing, now with the initials of their 3 children carved next to his own, a tradition they had started unintentionally. Margaret set her sewing down on her lap and looked out at the golden prairie stretching before them, the same prairie that had once separated 2 houses and 2 hearts that took 8 years to find the right words. "3 men proposed to me that week," she said, with a smile that time had not dulled. "And I was just waiting for you to ask." Thomas took her hand, the same hand he had held under that oak 23 years ago, now with the marks of time etched into the skin of both, and felt under his fingers the soft weight of a ring he had never taken off since that December. "And I was gathering the courage for 8 years, he replied. "I'm glad I didn't take 9. She laughed. That infrequent laugh that after 23 years was still exactly the same as the one he had first heard by a roadside in a broken horseshoe. And the sound blended with the afternoon wind that crossed the prairie, carrying with it, as it always had, everything that 2 people had taken so long to learn to say to each other. Because in the end, this is not just the story of Thomas and Margaret. It is the story of every silence you've ever kept out of fear, of every question you left unasked, waiting for the perfect moment that never arrives on its own. If there is someone in your life to whom you've been bringing firewood for a long time without saying why, perhaps this story is the sign you needed. Perfect words don't exist. Only those said in time, and those that aren't.